Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. And today we're reading Hellblazer number 97. But before we get into that, just a little catch up. In the last story arc, John found himself up against a demon named Boor, who was working behind the scenes to reestablish and bring back to hell the First of the Fallen, who at the end of the Garth Ennis story arc had been banished to the earth to live as a human. And apparently Boor and the First of the Fallen were lovers in hell, so that was Boor's motivation in getting the First of the Fallen back to hell. And in order to do this, he had to use some magic that revolved around the person that sent the First of the Fallen to hell, which was John. He needed John's soul specifically, and he needed John to willingly kill himself with the dagger that he used to defeat the First of the Fallen. And then John's soul would be sent to where the First is on Earth, and then the First could use that to, redemon himself. And the way that Boor was going to get John to give himself willingly to this plan is he possessed the child of a friend named Rich of John's and basically used it as blackmail. Like, if you don't do this, I'm going to take this kid's soul instead. And of course, John did not like that, and he figured out a way to defeat Boor and bypass this whole thing by splitting himself in two, taking all the stuff he didn't like about his soul, all his past misdeeds and guilt he felt, and put them into a second John, along with the demon blood that John has had since I think it was issue 9. So John kicked off this plan. It all worked out in John's favor. All the stuff he didn't like about himself that had been guilting him and corrupted his soul over the years was now gone and in hell, being tortured eternally by the First of the Fallen, who was now a demon once again back in hell. And we are left with a John Constantine who kind of has a fresh start now. He's got a new lease on life and a new soul that's been cleansed. So first things first, with issue 97, we got the cover. We see John Constantine looking out at us. He's smoking, of course, and he's holding up some sort of playing card that has a fox with a crown on its head. And we see that this issue is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see John is walking around at night in an open field, and he sees a wooden fence that has a break in it, and it is surrounding a forest. So he decides to hop the fence and go into the forest. And as he does this, the narration says, "It's all about facing your fears. Walk into a wood at night, they say, and when you emerge, something about you will have changed. Your passage into the dark forest is lined with uncertainty. Imaginary ghosts exist as imperceptible tremors in the undergrowth, formless shadows floating on the periphery. Perhaps you'll see the light in there, or maybe just step in a puddle and get your feet wet. Only one thing's for certain. If you can find the courage to come back from the darkest place of all, you might just leave your fears behind." And as John hops over the fence, we see the name of this issue is The Nature of the Beast. So the moment that John walks into the woods, of course, there's a bunch of plant life and nature, and John is a city boy. So immediately his coat is caught on a bunch of plants, and he yells out, "Oh, bugger!" And his narration says, "They must have been talking about some other sod when they came up with that daft bloody notion. Quite obviously, me and Mother Nature are about as compatible as the Pope and a page 3 tart. Besides, I'm normally better off facing myself after 12 pints of Guinness, even though it's the demon drink that got me off the beaten path in the first place." Then we get a flashback of how John got out in the middle of the field at night, and we see him puking in a toilet, and in the bathtub next to that toilet, for some reason, Chaz has a pillow and blankets and is sleeping in this tub. So as John pukes next to him, Chaz yells, "Christ almighty, Constantine, take it outside, eh?" So John takes his advice, and as he walks through the house they're in, getting his coat on, we see that Rich and his family are here, and they're sleeping on the couch together. So I think what's going on is we're still at Rich's uncle's house, which is where we left at the very end of the last issue. And I think this is actually the same night that everything went down and everybody was celebrating because they won. So as John is about to walk out, he looks over at Rich and his family on the couch, and the narration says, "Hardly my fault, really, after the night I've had. With the demon blood gone, there's a physical difference in me. I can feel it. My tolerance for alcohol now resides in hell, along with a shadow of my former self. hence my spectacularly dim-witted idea to head out on John Constantine's mission improbable. Then we see John walk outside of the house, and when we turn the page, we cut back to present. And in reference to John's mission improbable, his narration says, "Your mission, John, should you choose to accept it, is to find a path to enlightenment through the untamed wilderness. Your guts will self-destruct in 5 seconds." So as John walks deeper into the woods, he sees a light, and his narration says, "Still, I'm not the only pillock out and about tonight, apparently." And as the light comes closer into view, we see a little campsite set up with an old man sitting in front of a fire. And to get a better view of this, John has pulled a branch back, and he decides to call on the person saying, "Oi, anyone about?" But then his hand slips on the branch, and it smacks back into his face, and he yells out, "Ah, bollocks!" And as John recovers from that, a voice calls out from the camp and says, "Careful where you tread, son. Them branches can be right vicious buggers." And as John walks into the old man's camp, he says, "Sorry, mate. Just out for a breath, you know. No room at the inn, like." And the old man replies, "You're Rich Elder's friend, ain't you? Saw your lot trundle up to the farm tonight." And then John lights a cigarette and says, "Yeah. You one of the farm workers, then?" And the old man answers, "On and off, lad. I'm a shepherd, mostly." And then John looks around and doesn't see any animals, and he says, "Don't you need sheep for that, mate?" And the old man gives John a big smile as he pours some liquor into his tea mug, and he says, "I can watch my lot from anywhere, you sarky bugger. Sides, I'm watching out for the badger tonight. I looks after him like. Been watching out for you and all. Heard you trampling down the hollow, I did, and I says to myself, Tom, here comes a fellow with magic in him." And John looks kind of surprised by this, but he tries to play it cool, and he says, "Not me, Tosh. I'm on the old straight and narrow for a while." And Tom replies, "That's why you're outside at 3 a.m, is it? You can't hide your magic from gypsy folks, son. Not out here." And as he says this, he throws some food out to some hedgehogs who are just politely waiting on the edge of his fire. So there definitely seems to be something otherworldly about this man. And it's not just the animals that are acting strange. It looks like the plants are also beginning to grow extra thick around where John and the man are sitting. And as John notices this, he says, "Call of the sodden wild, eh? So why are all the bloody plants ganging up on me then?" And then I guess one of them brushes up against his hand, and I'm not sure if this is supposed to be poison ivy or something, but it definitely hurts because John jumps up from that, and Tom says, "Wouldn't have got stung if you wasn't so bloody leery." And then he grabs a hold of the plant that John just got stung by, and he says, "See? If you just grab 'em, they can't hurt you. It's all about facing your fears. Course, I reckon I could help you out there, son." And John jokingly says, "Said the actress to the bishop." And then in response to Tom offering to help John get over his fears, John says, "How's that then, Tom?" Then Tom gets a big grin on his face and he says, "You know, tell your fortune, governor. It'll only cost you a tenner." And to that, John stands up because he thinks this is a con now, and he says, "Not likely, mate. I've had enough of that lark for one night. Listen, thanks for the cuppa and all that." But Tom cuts him off saying, "What, you scared of a doddery old bugger like me, or of spending 10 bloody quid?" And then Tom reaches into his coat and pulls out a stack of cards, and he continues saying, "Tell you what, we'll put a little bet on it, eh? Just to prove Tom's being honest like. Let's say an old mate of yours shows up before we're finished. Reckon you take that bet for a tenner?" And John just kind of stares at him for a second, but then in the next panel, he's sitting down next to Tom, and the narration says, "Funny, isn't it? You spend your whole life looking at something in a certain way, like tarot cards, for an instance. There's more of a chance of seeing the future in a packet of cornflakes as far as I'm concerned. But there's something about this old geezer. Maybe it's the beer in my veins, the hypnotic sound of his West Country lilt. I mean, he's so completely sincere, even though he knows he's full of it. And so, much to my own surprise, then John says to Tom, "All right then, I'm game for a laugh." Then Tom begins to shuffle the cards, and also there seems to be some kind of aura coming off of him, like he's getting in some sort of trance. And as he feels the cards, he says, "Feel that? That's the air, that is, John. There's old lost stories in the breeze. You can hear 'em if you listen carefully." And then he fans out the cards, and he holds them out to John, and John picks one, and Tom continues, "Everything this country used to be, it's carried in the tales we've handed down from father to son. Some of them old stories are in books now, but the others, the really true ones, They am all around us. The animals know all about you, John. Then we see the card that John has picked out, and it has a fox on it, and without even seeing it, Tom says, "Well now, fancy that. A few skeletons in the closet, eh, lad?" I guess referencing what the fox card means. And then Tom explains, saying, "See, this old fox, he's the story of who you used to be. All the animals knew the fox weren't to be trusted. Give him half a chance, and he'd make a meal of you as soon as look at you. He were a sly one, that fox. Even the birds would have to keep an eye on that shifty bugger when he were about. But sometimes they're keeping a lookout for him, were the one thing he'd use to get his advantage like. I tell you, old fox relished each day back then. He knew what he wanted out of the land, see? There was just so much meat for that clever boy. A friend one day, and lunch the next." And under this narration, we're seeing an actual fox walking through the woods, and him seeing a bird on a branch, and then the bird falling, and the fox catching him in its mouth, and then killing it. Then we see some weasels watching him walk away. And I guess these are like the other animals that know that the fox is a killer, but sometimes he acts like a friend, but they never know if they can trust him or not. As we turn the page, we see that the weasels are talking to the other animals as the fox watches from a distance, and Tom's narration continues. "The stoats and weasels was the criers, keeping track of the sly ones coming and goings like, and telling all the other animals. After a while, old fox found himself alone among the beasts. Now, there were a demon lurking in the forest back then, a dark, brutish thing at the call of the devil himself. This devil had heard of the old fox, and it decided the sly one were just the prize that we're looking for." So under this narration, we're seeing a black figure that kind of looks like a wolf peering out from the forest edge, watching the fox. Then we see it jump out of the woods and rush towards the fox. And Tom's narration continues. "Out of the bracken came the black hound, its eyes bursting with flame and bloodlust. It missed on its first try, but only just. And suddenly, the old fox found himself running for his life." So as the fox takes off, we see it running towards a bunch of animals, and they don't really do anything. They just kind of watch as he runs by and doing nothing as they see he's being chased by this black wolf. And Tom's narration continues. "Poor scallywag. He come flying out of the woods with his brush up his arse and a wild look in his eyes, screaming at the top of his lungs he was for the other animals to help him. And of course, you can guess their reaction. That dog, it chased old fox over the country for 1 whole year. And every time it got close, the sly one was a step ahead of the chase. All the while, the fox was running through his bag of tricks. He was terrified now, for he knew his mortal soul was on the line. By the time he fled into the spring, he was too far gone to run anymore. So back in the forest once again, he decided to make his move." So we see the fox go back into the forest, and he crawls under a bush that has a puddle in front of it, and he lays on his back so that his head is upside down, and he looks into the puddle, and this creates an optical illusion where it looks like the fox is staring upright in the puddle. So this is the trap that the fox has set, and Tom's narration continues. "Quick as you like, the fox squirmed into a bush, sensing this was his last chance to shake the black hound. He knew the dog would be coming round the turn any second, see? But the old fox, well, he's the master of deceit, ain't he? He just turned himself arse upwards in the bush and began to laugh." So not only is the reflection trying to lure the black dog into this water, the fox is also laughing and taunting to hopefully get that dog into a blind rage. And Tom continues. "That black dog came hurtling round the corner, knowing the fox was at the end of exhaustion, and right in front of it, there was the sly one, sitting in a puddle it seemed. And because the hound had chased so long, because it wanted its prize so badly, it leapt at the fox's reflection and drowned back into hell." And just in case you didn't catch that whole story about the fox, like the old man had said, was kind of a fanciful way of explaining how John used to be. So John was kind of this sly old fox. Around him, his friends were always in danger, and John had gotten the attention of the first of the fallen and was on the run from him for a while. And then John, just like the fox, used a decoy version of himself to trick the wolf into jumping into the water and drowning the wolf, which of course is the first of the fallen going back to hell. So as John kind of sits and thinks about this, his narration says, "It takes a second for me to break the old gypsy's spell. Being so totally immersed in the smell of the fire, the sounds floating on the breeze, and the story of who I used to be." Then Tom asks, "What do you reckon then, son? Cards any good?" And John replies, "Not bad, mate." So John puts down the first card, and he gets ready to draw the second, and as he does that, John's narration says, "But I know, see, even if the old man doesn't. I'm not about to let on, but I can feel the witchery in the cards. Old Tom might think it's a fast one he's plugging, but it's not. It's something more." Then John picks out the next card, which we see is a butterfly, and Tom says, "Oh, now, see this, John. This is acceptance and change. 'Cause the butterfly, that's the story of who you are." Then we get another story told by Tom, and as we turn the page, we see a man riding out of the woods on a horse, and he's overlooking an open area where there's a river and some sheep on either side of it, and Tom's narration continues. "Paradur came into the river valley, searching for the black worm of the barrow. For a year he'd ridden. Now he was wary, questioning the path he'd taken. But marvelous sights awaited he. On each side of the river there was a flock of sheep, one black and one white. They would cross at the sound of bleating coming from the other side, and would become the color of the flock they swam to." Then we see on the page a giant tree that is half on fire and half normal looking with branches and green leaves and stuff, but there's also a bunch of butterflies flying around this tree as well. And underneath it, we see a man standing with two dogs, and Tom's narration continues. "But the most wonderful sight of all appeared to Paradur on the far bank. A tall tree, from roots to ground. One half was aflame, and the other green with leaves. And underneath, the most noble youth that Paradur was certain he'd ever seen." So the youthful man with two dogs calls out to Paradur, saying, "Paradur, gentle son of Ararog, you are welcome here." So Paradur goes over to where this young man is hanging out next to the tree, and as he approaches, the young man asks, "Why so confounded, Paradur? Have you lost your way?" And Paradur replies, I am unsure, Lord. Your land has a sprited air about it." And the boy replies, "Ha! There are no ghosts here, only new paths leading away, and butterflies." And as he says this, we see a couple butterflies land on his hand, and he continues, "Yet it pains me to see you so bitter, when you have already come so far. What troubles you in your heart?" And Paradur answers, "With your permission, Lord, I will tell you. I fear the next path I take may be the wrong one." And then the young man gestures towards the tree that's half on fire and half covered with butterflies, and he says, "Then look into the oak, Paradur, for your remedy lies within." So Paradur walks forward and goes over to the tree, and the young man continues explaining, "There, see? The one side burns, and the other remains rooted in the green. The insects, though attracted to the flame, must alight on the unfired leaves, lest they become consumed." And as Paradur watches all these butterflies flying around, some of which land on the actual branches with the leaves, and the others that land on the fire and get burned up. And Paradur asks, "Well, what does it mean?" And the young man replies, "The meaning is there for you to see. The butterflies, having transformed, choose life and earth over afterlife and the other world." And then the young man puts his hand on Paradur's shoulder, and he says, "And it's the choice of paths that matters, Paradur, not the path itself." And then the young man begins to walk away, and Paradur follows him as they're walking towards a specific path that's carved out like a little road. And Tom's narration says, "And so Paradur followed that noble lad down to the crossing of paths. He was more certain now that he was part of the land, knowing he would remain so until it was his time." Then we cut out of that story and back to the campfire, and Tom says, "And that is the story of who you are." And John is just staring at Tom with his mouth agape, and his narration says, "Suddenly, I'm aware of what's really going on here. At the same time, I haven't a bloody clue. But I know one thing. There are stories carved in my troubled soul, and the old man can read every one of them." So now John very cautiously goes to pick a third card, and his narration says, "I'm Paradur, standing at the crossing of the ways, and now I have to make a decision of my own. Do I want to turn the card and see who I'll become?" And it seems like he might be trying to stall here, because he doesn't pull the card right away. He just looks at Tom, and he kind of looks around at the plant life around him, and John's narration says, "The forest has moved away from the smoke and the noise now. I'm all alone with an old gypsy and the ghosts of everything we ever were, in a place where cynicism ends and mysticism begins. The forest's collective soul reaches out to me. It's a mixture of childhood smells and nighttime screeches. It's everything I want it to be. And I realize, for the first time in my life, that this is where I belong." Then we get a panel of a truck about to hit a rabbit as it drives down a city street. And John's narration continues. "England, my bloody England. We're letting it erode under the rubble of tires and the piss smell of chemical fertilizer. We're running forwards, leaving our scents behind us, and we're too busy arguing about it to notice. But I can tell what's going on. It may be scruffy and beaten, but it's still my country, my birthplace, my choice." And as John is saying this, he begins reaching out towards the plant that stung him earlier on the hand. And this time, he looks at it with intention, and he grabs it on purpose. And his narration says, "So I reach out and grab hold of it, just to see if it'll hurt. And I don't even feel the sting." But this moment is interrupted as Tom points at something coming out of the bushes, and he says to John, "Shh, there, John. There he is now, see?" And John replies, "Who?" And Tom answers, "My bloody 10 quid, son. Said he'd be along before we finished, didn't I? Look into the ferns. He ain't coming out, but he's there watching." And as Tom says this, we see a badger peek his head out from behind the bush. And Tom says, "That's your old friend, John. He knows you. He's a traveler, is old Brock, like you. Remembers you well, so he says." Then we get a little flashback of where this badger met John, and Tom narrates saying, "He was out in the hedgerow, scrounging for grub. It was somewhere up north. All them lights going, and a stench of sadness in the air. Anyone could tell that something bad had happened, and he was about to take his leave like. And then he sees you, all crying and confused, weight of the world on your shoulders to hear him tell it." And in this panel, we see John, who's younger, talking to a police officer. I think this is supposed to be in front of the club at Newcastle, but I'm not 100% sure because there's not enough detail in it. And Tom's narration continues. "Brock remembers you, John, because he never seen a creature so drained of life and magic." Then we cut to the present, and Tom continues saying, "He says you look different now, on the right track like, says you belong." And at this, John gives a smile and says, "Yeah, maybe I do." Then John holds out the cards back to Tom and says, "Here, take them back." And Tom says, "What about the last card, son? Don't you want to know?" And as John lights another cigarette, he says, "Don't have to, Tom. Not the path that's important, is it? It's the choice." And as John walks away from him, Tom pulls out the card that John would have pulled, and as he looks at it, he says, Maybe you're right, son. Probably just as well anyway, because this is the story of who you'll be again." And then we see the card, and it is once again the fox card. So potentially John is just doomed again to repeat all the crafty ways he used to be. So Tom doesn't actually show him this card, but John, as he walks away, says, "Oh shit, hang on a second, mate, I nearly forgot." And then he pulls out some money from his pocket, and he hands it to Tom, and he says, "There, don't spend it all in one place, eh?" And as Tom takes it, he says, "Pleasure doing business with you, Gov." And then John walks back into the woods and says, "You too, mate. See ya, eh?" And as John disappears into the trees, Tom says, "Depends on where you go, John." Then we see John walking out of the trees towards the fence that he jumped before, and his narration says, "Trudging out from the woods, it dawns on me that perhaps some of my fears have remained behind in the dark. It's only now that I begin to understand what might have just occurred." And as John jumps over the fence, he looks back into the woods, and he says, "Thanks, mate, whoever you are." Then we cut back to Tom in the woods, and he is now feeding the badger, and John's narration says, "He called me John, see, and I never once told him my name." Then we see Tom stand up, and he begins to glow with light. And then he says, kind of talking to himself, "Make good use of your choice, John Constantine. Perhaps you will follow the children after all, and find a path back to the shepherd." And then the light engulfs all of Tom's body, and he begins to disappear into the forest. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.